Hey kiddos, how's everybody doing this morning? Are we doing good? Give me a thumbs up if we're doing really good. You can give me a thumb sideways if we're doing okay. You can give me a thumbs down if we are not having a good day today. Okay, now take your thumb. Go ahead, bite off your thumb. Ready? Okay, bit off my thumb. Spit it back out. All right, there we go. We spit our thumb back out. Now you know a magic trick. How about that? Well, that was weird, Isaac. That was strange. But I am really excited to give you guys this week's Bible lesson. This week's Bible lesson is pretty neat. We are going to be learning about promises, right? We make promises. Raise your hand if you've ever made a promise. Keep your hand up if you've maybe actually broken a promise, which means you didn't keep it. Yep. So sometimes we make promises and we keep our promise, right? What would that look like? Can you think of a time that you made a promise to somebody and you kept your promise? Go ahead and think of a time. Pause pumpkin. Okay, so maybe you made a promise that you would do something like, I promise you, mom or dad, that I will clean my room. And then guess what you did? You cleaned your room. Good job, you kept your promise. Now, can you think of a time when maybe you broke a promise, when you promised to do something and then you weren't able to do it? Think about it. Pause pumpkin. So could you think of a time that you broke a promise that you made to somebody? Maybe you promised them, I promise I will go to your birthday party. But then when the birthday party happened, guess what? You weren't able to go. We don't always want to break our promises, but sometimes we do. The reason why is because we're not in control of everything. We can't control everything that happens, and so sometimes we break our promises. But God is not like us. We're going to see how God always keeps his promises. And God made a promise to a man in the Bible named Abram. And he made a very special promise. And so we're going to be taking a look at that promise. Do you guys remember what our big picture question is? Remember, our big picture question is, who is God? And you guys remember the answer to that question? The answer to the question, who is God is our creator and our king. Well, today we have a new big picture question, and that is, why can we trust God? Why can we trust God to always keep his promises to us? I'm going to let you think about that, and I'm going to give you the answer after we get our Bible story. But keep in mind as you listen to today's Bible story, what the question is, why can we trust God? Okay, so let's check out today's Bible story about Abram and God's promise to him. Let's watch.
Abram lived with his wife, Sarai. Abram was part of Noah's family who had spread out on the earth after the great flood. God chose Abram and told him to move to a place he had never been. God promised Abram three things: a large family, land for his family, and blessing. This was a good promise, but Abram was sad because he didn't have any children to inherit his blessing. Abram obeyed God. He went with his wife and nephew to the land of Canaan. God had a plan. He took Abram outside to remind him of his promise. "Look at the sky and count the stars if you can," God said. Abram couldn't count the stars. There were too many. "Your family will be that numerous," God promised. Abram believed God, and God was pleased. God said, "I will give this land to your descendants." Abram asked, "How can I be sure?" So God confirmed his covenant with Abram. God told Abram to bring 5 animals: a cow, a goat, a ram, a turtle dove, and a pigeon. Abram obeyed God. He brought all these to him, cut them in half, and laid the pieces opposite each other, but he did not cut the birds in half. Then, when the sun was setting, a deep sleep came over Abram. While Abram slept, God told him what would happen in the future. He said that Abram's family would be slaves in another country for 400 years. Then God would judge the nation and bless Abram's family. But first, Abram would live a long, peaceful life. When it was dark, a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch representing God passed between the animals. This showed that God would be responsible for keeping his promise. Years passed, and Abram still did not have the promised son. God hadn't forgotten, though. He promised that Abraham would become the father of many nations. God was so serious about his promise that he changed Abram's name to Abraham, which means father of many. He changed Sarai's name to Sarah. God said, "I will bless Sarah. She will have a son, and you will name him Isaac." God promised to keep his covenant through Isaac and his future family. God promised to bless all the world through Abraham. God sent Jesus from his home in heaven to be born on earth into Abraham's family. Through Jesus, all the nations of the earth are blessed because Jesus saves people from their sins.
All right. Well, I told you that we were going to hear a story about Abram and about how God made a promise to Abram. But Abram wasn't Abram by the end of the story, was he? By the end of the story, God had actually changed his name. And if you were listening, tell me what the name was changed to. That's right. He changed his name from Abram to Abraham. God also changed the name of Abram's wife. Do you remember Abram's wife's name? It was Sarai. And do you remember what Sarai's name got changed to? Go ahead, tell me. That's right. Sarai's name got changed to Sarah. Now, God made this very special promise to Abraham. And this type of promise is known as a covenant. A covenant is an agreement that people will make with each other. If I were to make a covenant with you, it would be, I promise to do this, and in exchange, you will do something for me. So I promise to make you this piece of art, and in return, you will clean my house for a week, right? That's a covenant. It's an agreement that we come together and we make. But God's covenant with Abraham is very interesting. It might seem very strange, the story that we heard, to our standard today, because things like that don't happen. It talked about cutting animals in half, and that's weird. But back then, if two people were going to make a covenant, what they would do is both people would walk in between the animals, right? But God, in Abraham's dream, had the torch and the pot. They went by themselves between the animals. So by doing this, God was showing that he alone was going to keep this covenant. He wasn't going to rely on Abraham to do anything to keep the covenant. God promised to do it, and God was going to keep the promise. So he didn't depend on Abraham to uphold his end of the bargain, if you would. This is a very special covenant, a very special promise that God made to Abraham. And do you guys remember what the promise was? Promised to give him many, many descendants. But there was a problem, right? Abraham didn't have any kids. So how was he going to have all these descendants if he didn't have any kids? Now years went by, and Abraham might be wondering, did God forget about his promise? But we know that God keeps his promises. You remember the question that I asked you earlier? And that is, why can we trust God? The answer to that is we can trust God because he is faithful and he does everything for his glory and for our good. So Abraham had his promise kept. He had a son, and his son name was Isaac. Sound familiar? Yeah, that's my name too. But this was a different Isaac. This was this promised Isaac that God promised to give Abraham. And then through Isaac, Isaac had sons. And then Isaac's sons had sons, and many, many sons. And many, many sons had Father Abraham, right? I don't know if you know that song. It's an old song. Father Abraham had many sons. Many sons had Father Abraham. I am one of them, and so are you. Don't make me sing the whole song. It sounds silly. So, but Isaac had sons, his sons had sons, and many, many sons. And so he had many descendants, just like God promised. And God's promise was that through Abraham's sons, the world would be blessed. All the nations would be blessed. And we see that promise kept too. Because do you know who was a descendant? Which means the great, 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 I don't know how many greats, grandson of Abraham? Do you know who that was? Well, we see that Jesus was born into the line of Abraham. And through Jesus, God blessed all the nations. And by doing so, he kept his promise that he made to Abraham. And that is a very good promise for us. Because the way that blesses us is because Jesus came to deal with our sin. He came to deal with what we could not deal with. Remember, God alone kept this promise. And so even though I screw up or I mess up, God keeps his promise and he dealt with my sin. And so I can then come to him and repent and ask for forgiveness. And he is faithful to forgive me of my sin. Remember, we can trust God because he is faithful and he does everything for his glory and for our good. What an amazing, amazing promise. Now, you might have a question about that, and that's okay. We're going to hear another kid's question. Are you ready for questions from kids? Let's check it out together.
Hey friends, I'm Pastor Brian. It's time for Questions from Kids. Michael from Charlotte, North Carolina asks,
some of my friends have a lot of money and say that their things are God's blessing. My family doesn't have very much, but the Bible says we are blessed by God. Why does God's blessing come as money for some, but not others?
Michael, that is a great question. And we see in today's Bible story that blessing was a big part of God's promise to Abraham. Now for Abraham, God blessed him through money, possessions, and land. But that is not how God blessed Abraham the most. We know that Abraham's relationship with God was the greatest blessing that Abraham received, and that God used Abraham as part of his plan to bring salvation to the world through Jesus. You know, as we read the Bible, we see that God blesses people in different ways. Sometimes he did bless people with money and possessions, but many people were blessed and they were incredibly poor. And then there was the rich young ruler who Jesus said that if he wanted to be blessed, he would have to give everything away. So God blesses people in different ways. But all of God's blessings have one important thing in common. They all come from God's mercy and grace. We don't deserve any of God's blessings. They are all gifts from him. Just like his greatest blessing to us, his greatest gift, which is salvation in Jesus. So, however God blesses you, whether it's money or some other way, we need to be grateful for what he has given us and not upset for what we wish he had given us. And we need to use what he blesses us with to bless others, just like Abraham did, and just like Jesus did. What are some ways you've experienced God's grace in your own life?
So could you guys answer Pastor Brian's question? And that question was, In what way have you experienced the grace of God? Another way of thinking about this is, what blessings has God given to you? We see that God gives blessings in different ways. Some people might be blessed with things and with money. Some people might be blessed with the family that they have. Some people might be blessed in where they live. Some people might be blessed in their gifts and their abilities. You might be able to do something that not everybody can do, and that's a gift. That's a blessing. And one thing that he asked was, how can we take our blessing and then give it and use it for God? So I want you to be thinking about, how has God blessed you? God's promise to Abraham was that he was going to bless him with a child. He was going to bless him with a son. And he was going to bless him with not only a son, but then grandkids and many descendants. Descendants means large family, right? And God kept his promise to Abraham. And so this brings us to our new Bible verse. I hope you guys memorized our last Bible verse in Colossians. This Bible verse that we have is found in the book of Galatians, and it's Galatians 3:29, and I'm going to read it to you. It says this: "And if you are Christ's, then you are Abraham's offspring, heirs according to promise." So what this means is that when we believe in God, we get to be a part of Abraham's family. And as a part of Abraham's family, we also get to be blessed by God. And the greatest blessing that we have is that God sent Jesus, and that God made a way so that we can be a part of his family, not just Abraham's family, but that we can belong to God. And that is the best blessing that we have, that we get to be called children of God, that we get to belong to the one who made everything. So I hope you guys will remember that, because I'm going to come back with that next week, Galatians 3:29. That's your homework this week. Well, I hope you have a wonderful week. I hope you have a wonderful week rejoicing in the promises of God, and the promise of God that he would bless all the nations, and he kept that promise through Jesus. So I hope that this week that you can rejoice in knowing that Jesus came, and he came to bless you by making you a child of God. All right. Can't wait to talk to you guys soon. Have a wonderful, 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 wonderful day.